Hi everybody, today I'm going to show you how I made this rustic American flag for less than $25 in materials. Check it out. So first things first, I have to protect the wife's home gym from sawdust, so as I hang my tarp, I'll go over the general plan. I'm going to need 1.5 2x4s and 1/5 of a sheet of 1/2-inch plywood. Now what I'll do with the 2x4s is strip off a 1/4-inch strip with a table saw from each side until I get down to a piece that's about 7/8 of an inch left. That's where it's kind of too dangerous to strip away with the table saw, but it works out perfectly because we'll use that to build the frame for the flag. So the pieces I'm using in this video here are some scraps that I had around, which is actually how I stumbled upon this method. I just had a bunch of extra little pieces of 2x4, some strips from where I jointed a piece of 2x4 to make a cage for my dog, and I had all these extra little strips, so I didn't know what to do with them, and I figured I would make a flag. And then as I did the math for it, it turns out this is probably the most economical way to make the flags. But you do have to have a table saw, and as mine I forgot to lock the wheel, so it started to run away from me right there. But anyways, we're going to take 1/4-inch strip off of each side of the 2x4. The safest way to do this is to move your rip fence a 1/4 inch in each time. Once you make that first cut, accounting for the 1/8 inch kerf of the blade, you just bring that rip fence in a 1/4 inch, and that way your off-cut piece is what you're going to be actually using to make the stripes for the flag. And then what would normally be your work piece that actually touches the rip fence is going to be that thicker piece. Now in theory, I guess you could set your rip fence a 1/4 inch from your blade and just cut all the strips without having to move your rip fence around, but I don't think that's very safe. So it's important that you strip those 2x4s in their full 8-foot length, because what we're going to do is use these dimensions here to cut our strips for both the stripes and in a vertical orientation for the union. But we're going to need different dimensions for building the frame that's going to go behind the sheet of plywood that those strips are attached to. So here's the cut plan I came up with to get all of your stripes, your union, and your frame done with just 1.5 2x4s. As I mentioned before, the other piece of this puzzle is the 1/5 of a sheet of 1/2-inch plywood. So when you go to your lumber store, what you're going to have to ask is that the employee cut this section off first at about 21 inches to give you a little bit of extra wiggle room, because their cuts aren't always 100% precise. And then after you've removed that piece, you're going to make a horizontal cut basically down the midline, so that you're going to take this 48 inches and you're going to split it into 24 and 24. That's the easiest way to do it. So you're walking out of the store with 3 strips of this one sheet of plywood. So next up, we're going to lay out these strips that we've now chopped down to size on our miter saw. And what I'm looking for here is just a grain pattern that I'm happy with. The next step is going to use a blowtorch and burn this grain pattern out to really make it stand out through the stain. But it's always a good idea to just do a dry run, lay it out, make sure that you don't have too much repetition, because you're stripping this from the same piece of 2x4. You could possibly have a lot of repetition in your grain pattern, so I like to move them around, flip them, and sort of experiment with the grain patterns until I find one that I like. Now if you're taking notes, you'll have realized that the 14 and 13/16 inch width of our union isn't evenly divisible by our 1.5 inch strips. It's pretty close, but not quite. So yes, I do keep a little stash of slightly slimmed down 10.5 inch tall strips so that I have one to run along the edge. The other option is to just kind of let it hang over and then trim it up with a saw at the end, but you get a lot of tear out on these thin pieces, so I wouldn't recommend that. I would recommend any trimming and sizing that you need to do, you do it before you put your stain on. Now on to the blowtorch for a bit of a shoisugiban technique. It's just really going to help that grain stand out through the stain. Now what you'll notice here is that because we are applying a lot of heat to these very thin strips of pine, they're going to warp, they're going to bend a bit, and that's okay. They're going to do the same thing when we apply the stain, because now we're going to saturate it with a bunch of moisture. But we're going to be able to easily manipulate these as we apply them during the glue up, and we can put a few extra brads here and there to keep them nice and straight as we glue it down. So don't worry too much about the warps and the bends. Just make sure that you are constantly moving your blowtorch. You're not going to concentrate it too much in one spot, but even if you do, we'll sand it next and help even that burn out and any little mistakes you make. The beauty of this rustic pattern, this rustic style, is that mistakes add to the character of the design, so don't be too afraid to make mistakes. It's okay. Now, an important note here is that I haven't found it to be worth it to burn the 10.5-inch strips that are going to be our union. Because we're using a navy blue stain, it just doesn't really help the grains stand out all that much, so I save time by just not even burning those pieces in the first place. Now, I like to use about a 120 grit sanding block just to run over each one of these pieces. It helps get rid of some of that debris so that the stain takes better, but it also evens out that burn and gives you the opportunity to actually sand down some of the pieces that are too dark and lightly sand some of the pieces that aren't dark enough and even it all out. Just remember that when your sanding is done, take a rag with some mineral spirits on it, wipe them each down so you don't have any of that dust on top. And then I always recommend another dry fit here. Just make sure you're still happy with the grain pattern once it's been burned. Now at this point I need to presto changeo my workshop into a nice big surface area so that I can lay everything out and begin staining. Try and remember when you're setting these out to keep them separated by the reds from the whites. You don't want to waste all of that time that you put into picking the perfect grain pattern just to mix up your stains and then forget which one goes where. And this can be done on the floor too. You don't need to do it on a bench top, but it really would save your back to be able to do it on a bench top. But just try to keep that grain pattern separated. And then I'm going to use a barnyard red stain, a Minwax navy blue stain for the union, and then I just do a whitewash. So I just take some white paint that I had from a project and I dilute it 50-50 with water, just tap water, put it in a plastic cup, mix it around, and then the only tip that I have for your whitewash is you want it to look a little darker now than what you want the final product to be. You'll notice in the very end when we put a polyurethane on it, it's actually going to thin that paint a little bit. So you want it to look a little more white than you would have desired, because when we apply that poly at the end, it'll thin it out a bit and you'll be able to see that grain really pop. So I like to let the red sit for about 5 minutes. You don't need a lot of time with this stain. The blue you want to let sit for about 10 just so I can get a deeper color to it. And try to stay consistent when you wipe them off so that you don't have just different shades of red or blue between the stripes or between the union. And then the whitewash I just leave on overnight. I don't wipe that off at all. Once your staining and whitewashing is all completed and dried, the next thing that I like to do is draw in the dimensions for the union. Because it's never quite a perfect fit with these strips, I want to make sure that everything is nice and square and everything is going to look level when you have it hanging on the wall. So I actually mark out some key points and then just draw lines with a level to make sure that as I'm gluing this up, everything is going to be nice and perfectly straight. And then, you guessed it, one more dry fit. Although this time what I want to do is pay close attention to any sort of knots or holes that need to be filled. You don't want that plywood backing to shine through all these holes in this character in your wood. So I mark with a pencil places that need to be filled in, and then I just take a little extra paint or stain and I fill in those spots on the plywood so that once I apply this with the glue, those spots won't be pine colored, they'll actually match the color of the strip or of the union. The other option here is you could just stain the entire piece of plywood with a uniform stain, just something to sort of subdue that bright pine color, and that would probably look good too and it would save you some time. I just prefer to do it this way. I like the look a little better. So just a quick reminder, this is your final dry fit. Do not mess this order up because you're going to be filling in these patches. You need to pay very close attention to how you stack these strips so that you remember in what order they belong. So here I'm just using some pieces of scrap wood to act as a nice barrier for my spray paint. Yes, I'm lazy, I use spray paint here, but it saves me some time and it's way easier. So I just use some pieces of scrap wood to keep that spray in check. And then next you'll notice that I just stain off with blue the entire union. That way I don't have to worry about the creases between the pieces of 2x4, I don't have to worry about the holes, just the whole thing is a deep blue. The next thing we're going to do is mark off our final dimensions. So we overcut this piece of plywood a little bit so that we could get to this final stage. These strips have shrunk, they've expanded, they've done all kinds of things. We want to know what's the perfect fit for this plywood. So I'm going to mark it, I'm going to draw a nice straight line with the level, and then take the circular saw to it to trim it down to its final dimension. Now onto the frame that's going to attach to the back of our plywood sheet. We're going to use those 7/8 of an inch leftover pieces of 2x4 to create this frame, and we're going to lay them in the thickest orientation so that we can catch the brads. Essentially what we're going to do is glue down and hold in place with brads each of these 2x4 strips that we've now stained. And we want something to catch those nails, that way they don't poke through the back. But what you'll notice is that when the 2x4 strips don't really behave as we want them to, we're going to have to force them into position and hold them there with a brad. So you're going to get a few strays that you'll just chop off with a Dremel later. But for now, the idea is to create structure, to give you a surface to place your mounting hardware, and then also to catch all of these brads. Specifically, I put this extra little notch in for the union because they're going to have to be attached in a vertical orientation, whereas everything else is horizontal, so we can't just go to the extremes. So the idea is to use the top beam to catch the top brad from the union piece, and then this little midsection is going to catch that bottom brad. And then the little vertical piece is actually for the left side of the horizontal orientation of the smaller strips, not so much for the union itself. And you'll also note here that I drive the brads in from the front so that they can catch these little strips and not poke out the front of the plywood. Alright, next we just want to set this on some props here on a little kickstand and use some black spray paint to evenly spray all the edges and all the backing. An alternative solution here is to use a stain. It's up to you. This is faster, and so I enjoy doing it this way, but it'd probably actually be cheaper to use a stain because your stain's going to go a lot further than a can of spray paint will. And once we've given that some time to dry, it's on to the final glue up. So I'm just using a little putty knife here to spread some wood glue out nice and even. What I like to do is essentially set up the union first, but also make sure that it's going to stay nice and square with our plywood frame when we put in these smaller strips. And also, I don't start to put the brads in until I'm happy with the position. You can always still move it around when you have the glue on there. It takes it a good 20-30 minutes before it even begins to set. So you can always play with this adjustment until you're happy with it. And once you're finally happy with it, just put a brad on each side, top and bottom for your union, left and right for your horizontal stripes. So just keep in mind that your glue is doing all the work here. These brads are just to keep it in position and apply some downward pressure until that glue can bond. But your glue is really going to do everything, so don't go overboard with the brads unless you come across a stubborn piece like I have here. So this one has not quite recovered from all of the heating and the moisture and all that kind of stuff, so it's a bit warped. So what I'm doing is just applying some pressure with my thumb and then sticking a brad in it to keep it from bending back in that direction. And then once we give this a few hours, the glue is going to hold it there for good. Just keep in mind this is going to shoot a random brad through the back of your plywood, so you'll see in the next step when we flip it over, we'll just have to snip it and then grind it down with a Dremel. Right, now on to the stars. I just use white spray paint for this. It comes through the best. This stencil I purchased on Amazon. I think it was around $8. And it came with 2 of 3 different sizes, so it'll last forever once you make the purchase. But just make sure that, like any time you paint, you're using your painter's tape to secure the edges. You're trying to keep it nice and tight to the wood so that it doesn't bubble up and create space for your spray paint to kind of go stray on you. So what I do is kind of move along columns of 1 or 2 stars at a time just to keep that stencil nice and tight to the wood. Because remember, the wood that you're spraying onto already has a lot of texture to it, so you don't want to create any extra space or you're going to get these really fuzzy edged stars, and this way it keeps it nice and crisp. So apparently my camera went completely haywire during this footage, but essentially all I'm doing here is wiping down with a rag with some mineral spirits again, and then applying some polyurethane per the instructions on the can. So you just stir it up, take a nice foam brush, brush a nice thin layer onto it, make sure that it follows the grain pattern so that it's going to look real nice in the end, and we'll speed through this footage because it's kind of hard to watch. So here we are. This is almost the finished product now. This is 3 coats of polyurethane. I wait about 3 hours in between coats, lightly sand with some 220 grit, wipe down with a rag that has some mineral spirits on it between each application. And this keeps it nice and smooth, keeps the bubbles and imperfections out, gives it a nice glossy finish, and protects it from the elements. So as I mentioned before, you see these stray brads that shot through the back so that we could secure those wobbly pieces of wood. All I'm going to do is take some snips, clip it down as best I can, and then just finish it off with a grinding attachment on a Dremel. You can use a file if you don't have a Dremel, or you can just snip it with some snips and leave it as is. And then I just go over it with the black spray paint just to make it look nice and uniform. And you'll also notice too that this section behind the union to catch those brads isn't perfect. My measurements were off just a smidge since I was using scrap pieces. I didn't want to waste it. So it doesn't really matter because these aren't really there for support. They're there to help those brads sink in and to not have to snip 20 brads in the end. We only have to snip 2. So you can kind of ignore that. The measurements I gave earlier aren't going to create this type of discrepancy. And the last step is to attach the mounting hardware. So I bought these on Amazon as well. It was a 100 pack for I think around $8, or maybe it was a 60 pack. Either way, super cheap. And you could technically just hang this from screws in the wall and just use this top support as a way to mount it. But I prefer this hardware. It gives it a more professional look. And I just drop them down 1 inch from the top, and the spacing between them doesn't matter all that much. I just keep it at 32. And here you have it, the finished product. Now I was able to do all of this for less than $25 in materials, and that's in 2021 prices, and lumber is sky high right now. So this is by far the most cost-effective way I've seen to do this. It does take time, but I'm going to make an entire separate video about the breakdown of the mathematics behind this and how it actually costs you 25 bucks. And if you do 10 of these, even if you have to buy all of the tools that I used, including the table saw, then you can still make money on this and walk away with an American flag of your own. So check back for that, will you? So thanks for watching the video today. I hope I was able to share a plan with you that maybe you hadn't seen before, or a method that you hadn't considered. If so, please consider leaving a like, subscribing to the channel, and check back for this follow-up video. Like I said, I'll go through the breakdown of exactly what it costs to make this, including the tools, and if you sell these on something like Etsy or even Facebook Marketplace, you can easily make your money back on this. So thanks again, and we'll hope to see you soon. Bye.